My name's Caitlin. I'm 42 years old, and I live in a quiet suburb outside Minneapolis with my husband, Brandon. To anyone looking in from the outside, my life seems simple. I'm listed as a full-time housewife, someone whose days revolve around groceries, cleaning schedules, and keeping a calm household. What almost no one knows is that behind that unassuming role, I run a medical equipment distribution company as its CEO, a business that generates millions in annual revenue. My personal salary sits around $145,000 a year, yet Brandon has never known the truth. He has lived for years believing I depend entirely on him. We met when I had just turned 30, at a casual gathering hosted by a mutual friend. Back then, Brandon was attentive in a way that felt rare. He noticed small things most people overlooked, like the way I favored my left hand when holding a coffee mug, or how my expression softened whenever an old favorite song played. He made me feel seen. I remember thinking that if I could spend my life with someone who paid that much attention, it would be more than enough. We dated for nearly a year before getting married, and in those early months, I truly believed I had chosen wisely. But the happiness I thought would last began to thin not long after the wedding. Brandon stopped trying to move forward. He made excuse after excuse to stay in a job that barely covered our basic expenses. Whenever I gently suggested exploring better opportunities, he dismissed me, sometimes sharply. "Don't try to make me live by your standards," he'd say. "I'm not your employee." I tried again and again to approach the subject carefully, even when my own company had an opening in an administrative role. It required nothing extraordinary, just basic professionalism and communication, and paid more than double his current salary. I had even spoken personally to HR to hold the position. When I mentioned it to him, his expression hardened. "So now you think I'm useless?" he snapped. "You need your wife to get you a job? Stay out of my business." I was speechless. I couldn't reconcile that reaction with the man who once claimed he loved me deeply. Still, I endured. I told myself that as long as I could keep our lives financially stable, the rest would fall into place. Every month, without fail, I transferred $1,400 into Brandon's account as a living allowance. He spent it within 2 weeks, then complained endlessly about the cost of groceries, gas, and how stressful life was. I knew where the money was going: sneakers, online games, impulse buys, but I stayed quiet. The money itself didn't hurt me. What hurt was that he never once asked how I was doing. He never noticed when I worked late into the night answering emails or flew between cities in the same week. In his mind, I was a woman living off what he provided, while he carried the weight of the household alone. I remember one morning when my mother came by to help clean while I was tied up in back-to-back online meetings. When Brandon got home, he threw his keys on the table and said something that made my mother freeze in place. "Another stranger in the house again. I need peace and quiet." I stood up immediately, anger tightening my chest, and told him she wasn't a stranger. She was here to help us and deserved respect. He shrugged and said he had a right to feel uncomfortable in his own home. I turned away so he wouldn't see the tears. That was the first moment I felt something in our marriage crack beyond repair. After that, the house filled with silence. We still shared meals, sometimes watched the same shows, but everything felt mechanical. There were no spontaneous hugs, no soft goodnights, just two people coexisting under one roof. Brandon grew more irritable by the day. A towel folded the wrong way, the remote not where he expected it, the coffee machine breaking, even though he'd used it last, somehow became my fault. I felt less like a partner and more like a servant. One evening, after a tense meeting, I walked in the door and hadn't even removed my shoes when he held up a wrinkled shirt and snapped, "This isn't ironed. Do you ever do anything right?" I laughed hollowly, swallowing my anger. I was negotiating multi-million-dollar deals by day, yet being scolded over a shirt by night. I stopped defending myself because every word I spoke only gave him more ammunition. The exhaustion settled deep. When I caught the flu and ran a high fever, unable to leave the bed, Brandon didn't bring medicine or even ask how I felt. He stood in the doorway and said, "Hurry up and get better. I don't have time to take care of you." That sentence chilled me more than the illness. That wasn't how a husband spoke to his wife. That was how someone spoke when they no longer cared. The loneliness became overwhelming. I lay awake many nights wondering when the man who held my hand on our wedding day had become the person who hurt me the most. I questioned why I, a woman who had overcome so much, was still holding on to something that was slowly destroying me. I told no one, not even my mother, Frances, who had always protected me fiercely. I didn't want her to worry or see me broken. I never imagined Brandon would involve her in the most painful way possible. One Saturday afternoon, my mother came over with my favorite stew and a basket of fruit. We were talking when Brandon walked in, sighed loudly, and muttered, "Again? There's always someone sitting around this house." My mother tried to stay polite, explaining she was just visiting. Brandon opened the fridge and said, as if I weren't there, that he didn't want to eat with outsiders and that some people didn't understand boundaries. I watched my mother hesitate, then quietly say she should leave. When the door closed behind her, I confronted him, asking if he realized how cruel he was being. He looked at me calmly and said he was just being honest and that my feelings weren't his problem. The house felt cold after that, like something essential had drained out of it. I had no idea that weeks later, everything would collapse even further. I don't remember exactly when I fainted, only that my vision blurred at the office and the lights seemed to dim. I woke up in the emergency wing of Mayo Clinic with an IV in my arm. The doctor said exhaustion had caused the collapse, but my tests showed something concerning. 2 days later, I was taken into a private room and told they had found a tumor in my pancreas. It was early, treatable, but the road ahead would be hard. I wasn't afraid of the diagnosis itself. I was terrified of facing it alone. I texted Brandon that night, telling him I was hospitalized and needed to talk. He never replied. I called and it went straight to voicemail. I started treatment without him. The infusions drained me, my hair fell out, my reflection slowly changed. I fought on, telling myself I couldn't let him disappear like this. For 2 weeks, I stayed in that hospital alone, lying to my mother about being on a business trip so she wouldn't worry. Then, one afternoon, Brandon appeared at my door. He stood there coldly, placed a folder on my bedside table, and spoke as if this were a transaction. "I've filed for divorce. The house and car will be in my name. That's fair. And honestly, I don't even know how long you'll be around." I stared at him, stunned. Something inside me shattered into pieces. Not because he was abandoning me, I'd already expected that, but because of the sheer coldness in every word. He didn't come to check on me. He came to claim what he thought he was entitled to, as if I was someone whose value was about to run out. I pressed my lips together, hiding every emotion. I didn't want him to see me weak. I nodded and said quietly, "Pick whatever you want. Thank you for coming." Brandon paused, maybe surprised by how easily I agreed. He shrugged, turned away, and said one last thing. "Not like you have a choice anyway." When the door clicked shut behind him, I didn't cry. Instead, a cold smile tugged at my lips. I whispered to myself, "You just woke up the real me, Brandon, and soon you'll realize you made the biggest mistake of your life." I picked up the bedside phone and called the one person at my company I trusted, Eric, my chief financial officer. He had always been loyal, discreet, and the one who knew best just how much power I truly held. "Eric, I need your help with something," I said, my voice unusually calm. He was quiet for a moment, then answered, "I've been waiting for this call. Just say the word." I nodded slightly, even though he couldn't see me. I lay still in that white hospital room, watching the soft sunlight filter through the curtains, strangely at peace. Maybe because I had finally decided to let Brandon go, but not the way he thought. He wanted to discard me at my weakest. Fine, but in that moment, I realized I wasn't the one who needed to be set free. It was him from the life I'd carried on my back, a life he never even knew I built. 3 days after that cold hospital visit, Eric came to see me. No flowers, no sweets, just a leather briefcase containing everything I needed. He set it on the table and asked gently, "Are you sure you want to go through with this plan?" I looked straight at him, my gaze unwavering. "Yes, and I want everything to start tomorrow." Eric understood. He was the only one in the company who knew I had used my mother's name as the legal representative to keep my identity hidden. I'd always wanted to live modestly, never letting Brandon know I was the one behind the major contracts his company depended on. Looking back, maybe I had been too kind. The next morning, I signed a short letter terminating the supply agreement between my company and Vital, where Brandon worked in logistics. That contract made up over 60% of Vitaltech's revenue last quarter, and I was the one who had approved it after a pitch led by Brandon nearly a year ago. I remembered clearly how excited he was, boasting that it was thanks to him that the company had secured a deal with a major partner, without ever realizing that major partner was sitting just one bedroom wall away. The termination letter was sent out at 8 a.m. Monday. By 3 p.m., I received a call from the CEO of Vital, Mr. Peterson. He kept it brief. "We're quite surprised. If possible, we'd like to know the reason." I replied, calm but firm, "I've been made aware that one of your employees has demonstrated inappropriate behavior, disrespect toward female colleagues, and signs of misusing company assets. As a major partner, I cannot condone that." There was a pause before he asked, "What's the name of that employee?" I answered simply, "Brandon Scott." That afternoon, Brandon came home late, looking pale. He had no idea I had hired a private lawyer to send him a counter-divorce filing, this time with a clause requiring him to vacate the house, which was under my name, within 30 days. That house, by the way, I bought. I only added his name to appease my prideful husband. Brandon opened the fridge to get some water without saying a word. Then, after a few moments of silence, he finally said softly, "I got laid off." I set my book down, not the least bit surprised, because of the terminated contract with my company. He turned to look at me, eyes full of disbelief. "How do you know?" I walked slowly to the desk, pulled out an envelope and placed it on the table, and said, my voice calm to the point of being unnerving, "Because I'm the one who ended that contract. I'm the CEO of Silver Med, Brandon, the company you proudly claimed to have won over, the company you thought you were smart enough to convince." Brandon froze. He looked at me like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. I continued, "For all these years, I've paid every bill, covered your credit card debt, paid tuition for your nephew when your cousin hit hard times. I transferred over $1,500 a month in allowance when your actual salary didn't even come close to that. I did it all because I believed in something called love." Brandon stepped back. He grabbed the envelope from the table, opened it with trembling hands, then looked up. This can't be real." I smiled. "Divorce papers, asset division terms, and your meeting schedule with my lawyer. You have 30 days to move out, and the $3,200 monthly mortgage payment I won't be covering anymore." He was stunned. The air thickened around us, filled only by the heavy breathing of the man who once leaned on me like the whole world belonged to him. I walked away, leaving him there with numbers and a brutal reality crashing down. In my heart, there was no hatred, just clarity. Brandon had lived too long in the shadow I created. Now it was time for him to step out and face what he had taken for granted. Just 3 days after Brandon received the official divorce papers from my lawyer, the hospital room phone rang near midnight. I was exhausted for my second round of chemo, but when I saw his name on the screen, I knew right away the panic had begun. "Caitlin, please, just hear me out." His voice was shaky, raw, like he'd been crying. I said nothing. On the other end was a man in free fall, and I, the one he had once left behind, was now the only lifeline he was desperately clinging to. I was wrong. I was so wrong. I was stupid. I thought you were just some dependent woman, but now I know. You were the one holding everything together. You were the reason my life didn't fall apart. I put the phone on speaker, leaned back against my pillow, and closed my eyes, not because I was moved, but because I wanted to hear every desperate word, something I had once wished for, back when I lay in a hospital bed battling illness alone. Brandon kept going, his voice rising with urgency. "I've lost everything. The house is about to be foreclosed on because I can't make the payments. The company, they didn't just fire me. They put a formal warning in my file. No one else will hire me now. Caitlin, please give me another chance." I opened my eyes, watching the soft glow of the nightlight. Calm and cold, I spoke. "Anything else?"
A chance. You had a whole decade to respect me, to love, to share, to understand, and you chose not to. Now that everything you were used to is gone, now you realize my worth. Too late, Brandon. I know you're angry, but we were happy once. Please remember those times. I'm begging you. I smiled faintly. Brandon, do you remember the name Alyssa? The other end of the line suddenly went silent. I could hear his breath catch. How did you find out about that? I spoke each word sharp as a blade. The CEO of Vitaltech called to apologize and happened to mention they'd quietly investigated an internal complaint. Turns out you had a personal relationship with the new intern, Alyssa Morgan, 24 years old, daughter of the Chicago branch director. Should I go into detail about those late overtime nights? Brandon started stammering. No, it's not what you think. It wasn't like that. You're right. It was worse than I thought. I hung up, not another word. Right after I opened my contacts, hit block. I also emailed my lawyer requesting a no-contact clause during the divorce proceedings and began preparing a civil suit for breach of marital duty. In the state of Minnesota, with proof of infidelity, the betrayed spouse can file for emotional damages, and I had plenty. The next morning, my lawyer, Eliza Harper, came to the hospital. She showed me a stack of screenshots from conversations between Brandon and Alyssa, flirtatious messages, hotel meetups, even selfies taken in the Vitaltech office, all time-stamped and geotagged. I wasn't shocked. I just felt relieved. Every suspicion I'd pushed aside now had a name. "I've sent a formal demand for $85,000 in damages," Eliza said. "He'll likely contest it, but with this evidence, the court will be on your side." I nodded, not because I needed the money, but because I needed my dignity placed where it belonged. A week later, I was discharged, temporarily for at-home monitoring. During that time, Brandon tried to contact me through emails, social media, even showed up at my company's office, not knowing security had already been instructed not to let him anywhere near. Every attempt to win me back only confirmed one thing. Brandon didn't love me, he just didn't know how to live without me. I started rewriting my financial plans, this time with no more husband's living expenses category. I also approved Eric to hand over the COO role to a new hire so I could step back, slow down, and finally enjoy some peace.
And when I stood on the balcony of my new home, the one I moved into after leaving the old house full of memories and pain, I closed my eyes and felt the cool breeze brushing through the short new hair that had begun to grow after treatment. I didn't need a man to feel worthy. I just needed myself, strong, clear-headed, and never again letting anyone else define my life. Rumors of Brandon's downfall spread like wildfire in the local business community. Vitaltech cut the contract, and his termination file was quietly circulated to partner companies and industry contacts. Soon enough, Brandon became the name everyone wanted to avoid, a logistics employee caught in a scandal and facing legal consequences for breach of marital duty. With no home to return to, Brandon moved in temporarily with an old friend in a cheap apartment complex in Brooklyn Park. A few weeks later, I heard he sold the car he once proudly called his symbol of freedom. Part of the money went toward paying off credit card debt, the same cards he had used so freely to buy gaming gear and lavish meals. No one wanted to hire someone with a stain on their record and no practical skills. Eventually, he had to accept a job on the night shift at a delivery center, where the meager paycheck wasn't enough to cover monthly bills. Calls from collection agencies started piling up. His small apartment echoed with the sound of late-night phone rings, not from loved ones, but from places chasing unpaid debts. As for Alyssa, the young woman who once laughed with Brandon after hours, she vanished from social media just days after the scandal broke. I didn't know what happened to her until Eliza, my lawyer, told me her family had agreed to settle part of the damages privately to avoid public litigation. Word had it her parents took her back to their farm in Iowa and cut all ties with her former life. For them, that was the only way to salvage the family reputation. As for me, my final treatment ended on a crisp autumn morning, when the doctor looked at me and said, "Your test results show you're completely clear." I didn't say a word. I just smiled and gently squeezed his hand. It was the moment I felt reborn. I returned to work after 2 months of rest, but this time I wasn't the same Caitlin who tried to balance career and marriage. Now I was Caitlin on my own terms, focused, calm, and no longer weighed down by anyone who couldn't see my worth. The company welcomed me back with a simple but heartfelt team meeting. Everyone stood and clapped when I entered the main conference room. Eric smiled and handed me a mug that read, "Welcome back, boss." I had once doubted whether I could start over, but in that moment I knew not only had I come back, I'd come back stronger than ever. In the months that followed, I received more than a few date invitations, some from business partners, a few from old friends who had followed my story online, but I turned them all down. Not because I'd closed my heart forever, but because I knew I still needed time to heal, to enjoy a life no longer bound by responsibility to someone unworthy. I bought a small lakeside house in Duluth, where I could watch the sunrise each morning and listen to birdsong each evening. It wasn't grand, not as luxurious as the old house, but it was my space, peaceful, whole, and no one entered unless invited. One weekend afternoon, while I was brewing tea in the kitchen, Eric stopped by. We sat on the porch, watching the lake shimmer under the golden sunset. "Have you thought about getting married again?" he asked, half teasing. I looked at him and smiled softly. "Not right now, maybe someday, but for now, I'm happy like this." He nodded, saying nothing more. The breeze carried the scent of pine and damp earth, and in that moment I knew I hadn't just overcome Brandon or the illness, I had overcome the fear that once kept me silent too long. I took a sip of hot tea, thinking quietly to myself. In the end, I became the one who wrote the final chapter of my own story. From my own journey, I've learned that resilience doesn't come from moments of strength, but from the times we rise after being pushed to our lowest. I once gave my heart to someone unworthy, once sacrificed in silence without recognition, but now I live for myself, no longer trying to please anyone. True happiness began the moment I chose to put my self-respect above everything. What do you think of Caitlin's journey and her decisive choice? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to follow the channel for more powerful and heartfelt real-life stories.